Welcome to Sykes Peak, the podcast that's going to change the world one person at a time. So this is a continuation from our initial podcast on trauma. We are talking about how trauma affects how it affects the body, how it affects the mind, how it affects your decision making, how it affects your choices, how it affects your just your response mechanism. We talked a little bit about two aspects of our nervous system, of the central nervous system. It's called the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And like you said, we're going to nerd out for just a minute. The sympathetic, we likened into a gas pedal on a car, and the parasympathetic was more like the brake pedal. In other words, when you have a traumatic event or something scary happens or whatever, you go into a fight or flight response. And the fight or flight response is the parasympathetic that's kicking in. Sympathetic is just operating all the time. It's what you hear. It's how you respond in your environment. It's how you push through the day, how you think through things. That's your sympathetic nervous system. Your body is responding to that, to tell you to breathe, to tell you to sweat when you're hot, to shiver when you're cold. It's
digest food.
Yeah, it's the messages that are coming from your brain to operate.
Right.
You know, how to breathe, when to breathe.
Yep.
So in the parasympathetic, is the response aspect to that. In other words, like I said, when you sweat, when you're hot, you sweat. When you're cold, you shiver. Those are response mechanisms that the parasympathetic kicks in with. Now, when you go through trauma, your body reacts to that. Now, if it's just one piece of trauma or one event of trauma, you react to that differently. If it's a sustained trauma, like under a battle situation or in an abusive home situation, you don't know what's going to trigger the next explosion or the next fight. Then you're in a constant state of readiness. I think that a lot of people experience that in their lives today, and maybe some people that are listening to this podcast experience that. Another aspect is that it's not even a physically abusive environment, but it may be an emotionally abusive environment where you haven't been guided and led to understand who you are, to support you and help you to grow and help you to make good life-sustaining decisions, and it causes you to question. Because your response mechanism is going to be, am I pretty? Am I good looking? Am I right all the time? Am I wrong all the time? Am I smart? Am I stupid? You're trying to answer those questions, and you don't have any support through your youth and your childhood and your youth. Then as an adult, you're still doing those questions. And so it affects your sense of self and who you are. And we've already had podcasts on self-esteem and what that means. But that's kind of just a rundown of what we were talking about when we were talking about trauma. Now, the direction I want to go with this is childhood responses. What happens with children and trauma when when a kid goes through a traumatic event? Any ideas or any thoughts that you have on? Well, I dealt with children.
Yes, you did.
That was probably my area. Well, I'll run with that then. The question is, what happened? What took place? I had a little kid one time in a counseling session. He was like 4 or 5 years old, and this is a great little guy, and just um, and just, oozing with love. I mean, he
Oh,
was
yeah.
just a lovable kid. And he would come to my office and he would go, Dr. Keith, and come running in and jump in my lap and give me a big hug. And, as a therapist, you look at that and that, number one, makes you feel amazing, because you recognize and you realize that you've bonded with your client and bonded with, in this case, with this kid.
Have that trust.
And,
Yeah.
and his trauma was overwhelming. His dad was in prison. His mom was nowhere to be found. She was probably in prison too. He was living with his aunt, and she was a very loving, caring type person. And so he was getting the support and the love and the things that he needed, but he still was missing his mom and dad. And that was a big challenge to help him to understand, to get him to the point to understand that what he's got in front of him is what's best for him. And, how do you teach a 4-year-old, 5-year-old that this is what's best for you when he's saying, I miss my dad? But,
Right.
but, the emotional support that he was getting helped him to be able to overcome the trauma that he had experienced. Now, it's a tender age, 3, 4, and 5, your brain is developing and it can get messed up. You can really get messed up in that age range. And I look back at my 3, 4, and 5, age range. When I was a kid, I was taken care of by my grandmother. I mean, some of my earliest memories. And my dad was working, my mom was working. They became 2 career families, and so both were working. So my grandmother took care of me during the day until I started school. And she was a school teacher, so I had the best of both worlds. I had my grandmother, whom I adore and refer to her as Saint Cora. She taught me how to write, she taught me how to count, she taught me, all the things that I needed to be prepared for when I went into first grade, because we didn't have kindergarten back then. So it could have really been messed up if my grandmother was not capable of teaching me or training me. And I remember what she taught me was faith. And this is a big issue for children to learn, is how to learn faith. And we prayed about everything. I mean, everything. And she would say, well, let's pray about it. And we'd sit there and we'd say a little prayer and we'd go on, and it was really funny because she would make me get a switch when I was not acting appropriately. That's a good way of saying I was being bad. And she would make me get a switch, and she'd tell me, don't cut me a little one, you cut me a big one. And so I go break off a switch. And she was adept at starting with one end and pulling all the leaves off that switch. And it was a forsythia bush. You know what a forsythia, the big yellow bush that comes out in the spring? And she would pull the leaves off of it all the way up to the last leaf, and it would look like a riding crop. Okay. And so she would, and then she'd switch my legs with that. And then she'd take the switch and she'd put it on top of the refrigerator. And she would look at me and she would tell me, she said, that's what you're getting for Christmas, is a bundle of switches.
All right.
And by December, there was a bundle. I mean, I cut a switch every day, so, there were a lot of things that were going on. But what I learned was obedience, faith, trust, respect. I mean, things that I needed to learn, so that when I got into first grade, second grade, and that sort of thing, that I knew how to treat my teachers, and I knew how to be responsive. And plus, my parents were that way. I mean, they taught me those things as well. But those were the formative years. So if there's some kind of traumatic event, in those formative
Early
years. Now,
years.
what's a traumatic event? Parents divorcing.
Yeah. Yeah.
If the child's 2, there's not so much of a trauma.
Yeah.
Child's 3, it's a whole different ballgame because they are a little bit smarter. They understand that somebody's missing in this picture.
Major changes in the environment.
And, and so I could almost tell you with my adult clients how many of them experienced that separation or divorce before they were age 5.
Yeah.
I mean, it was about 85% of the adults that I saw had some kind of traumatic event in those 3 years.
You talk about early stage development, early childhood development, and formative years and what goes on in those areas. And I think it's helpful to think about it like when you have your brain development starts instinctually. That's what it starts with, your instincts. It builds those physiological, deep down, biologically connected nervous system. And then it develops higher level emotions, connectedness, empathy, and then it develops into higher thinking, philosophy. When you think of that, the higher thinking stuff, the abstract things like what is a relationship? What does that mean? Like you've had relationships, but you never had to define them.
Concepts.
Yeah. And what is love?
Abstract.
What is fairness? What does that mean?
Who's God?
Yeah. What's justice? Right. So when you think about the formative years, again, it gets down to that deep instinct, those deep emotions that are not these abstract ideas. They're very deep, basic parts of who we are as people. And trauma has a way of permeating that at any age. But again, when you're in your formative years, it almost hardwires it into a person. You were talking about being disruptive. And I think that's one of the issues when it comes with a lot of people who have experienced trauma. You'll see this in kids too. They're disruptive. They're loud. They act out. And I think part of the reason is again, that sympathetic, parasympathetic. When the environment's too quiet, trouble's coming.
Yeah.
I don't like this.
Yeah.
I'm used to being in a yelling environment all the time. I'm used to the war zone. That actually puts me to sleep. Like that calms me down. It's like when you grew up in a big city your whole life and then you go out in the country for the first time and you try to sleep at night. You're like, it's too quiet out here. Like what is this?
Right. Got to have a fan on.
Yeah.
Got to have the door open.
Oh my God. I mean, I know people who will have TVs and things running all night. And I think that's a big part of it is that it's you're attempting to get down to that instinct level of your nervous system, and you're trying to calm it down with creating tension in your environment, that conflict, that chaos, because that's what's comfortable and normal for you.
Right. Well, one of my notes here is adverse childhood experiences. They call them ACE. So they have a cumulative effect. The more that you have, then the higher the likelihood of physical and mental health issues.
Absolutely. And
it's not adult.
And those are not additional. Those are multiplicative.
Yeah.
They're not just 1 + 1. Now I have 2. It's more like multiplied.
Right.
And that's where you get that, like you said, compounding effect.
Right.
It's much more than just, I had 2.
And it's also how you think about those experiences, because if you look back on it as an adult, you have a new conceptual understanding of what was going on in that experience. As a child, it was it was something that made you uncomfortable. As an adult, you begin to look back and you have the added responses to it of that was disgusting.
Yes.
That happened to me. Yep. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened to me.
Right.
And
it's interesting. I can't remember where I read it, but there was I love studies on twins, and siblings that are raised in the same homes and things like that. And I think there was a story about 2 twins in a book I read. Couldn't tell you where now, but one, when they both got older, one was, destitute, addict, life was in ruins. And the other was a successful business owner doing great for himself. And they were both asked, like, what got you? And it said, oh, my parents made me this way.
And they both responded with
the same answer,
they
but
had
it's
the same
completely
parents.
different view of their childhood and the things that happened to them and their response and perception on it. I just got done reading an article about happiness, and it was interesting because there's multiple different definitions for what people define as happy. Some are physical health, some are success, some are relational. But one of the things that said was a strong indicator of the adverse effects or negative effects of people's view on why they're not happy is actually just their perception of what that is. And it's not even the happiness. It's not the condition. It's your perception of it.
Right. And and there's a lot of people that say, perception isn't reality.
Right.
But what happens is your perception guides your reality.
Yes.
And so, the people that say perception is not reality are the ones that have been caught in a situation like an affair or something like that. Why do you think I'm having an affair? Well, it was just I perceived, or you present the perception of doing this. I mean, I see you talking to this person. I see you, around this person a lot. It might be a colleague. It might be something that somebody that you work with.
My parents' drug addictions led me to Christ versus my parents' drug addictions led me to self-harm.
Right.
Those are two completely different, same stimulus, different reactions.
Well, and it, when you come to that adult view, looking back at your childhood trauma, that has to be guided. I mean, if because you can get off the rails real quick.
Oh, you can.
And what happens is that, through therapy, and a good therapist is going to say, is going to show you, is going to point to you that the behaviors that you have today are a result of your perception of what happened to you as a child.
Right.
In other words, it's you're making choices based on how you think or what you understand today of what happened to you as a child. And so, you start making poor decisions. Relationship decisions. And I dealt with teenagers a lot on this concept, and that was, they would get in a situation, they have a boyfriend or, girlfriend or whatever. And they get in a situation where they end up having sex. And after that, and that relationship dissolves or it breaks up or whatever.
Right, yeah.
And then they go into this deep depression.
Yep.
And one of the things that they begin to believe, or they begin to tell themselves, is that I'm no good. They feel guilty about having sex because they've been taught and trained, that you wait until you get married to have sex, and they develop this idea that they're no good, and so I might as well continue in this behavior. Now, how crazy is that? That thought process, but that's how they think. That's because they think, well, I gave it up to him, I might as well give it up to her, or give it up to him. Or
addicts do the same thing. The addicts do the same thing when they go back to using. Sometimes is, well, I already went ahead and well, I already bought the pack of cigarettes and I smoked one. I might as well smoke the rest. Like, wait, what? Just stop there.
I do that with M&Ms.
Oh,
yeah. Well, we bought the 5-pound pack. I might as well go ahead and finish.
It's very easy. It's very easy to say, well, I've already done this. Might as well just keep going with it.
Right. And it's just a faulty way of thinking about things. Yes. And that's why you have a therapist that comes along and says, no.
And why? Says who?
Your thought process doesn't have to go this direction.
Yeah.
And you begin to think differently about yourself.
Yeah.
I think that it is, that trauma has powerful effect on the way that people think about things.
Thank you for joining us today and listening in to Sykes Peak as we continue our series and talking about stress, anxiety, and trauma. We hope that you have gained some value in listening to us today and will join us again in the future.